Trainings for Therapists in Training by Tina Kopko.
All right. So, as Yvonne mentioned, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I am also what's called a certified grief recovery specialist. That is a certification program with a particular organization called the Grief Recovery Institute, and they they come from a background not of being therapists or clinicians, but from the point of view of someone who was grieving an intense loss and couldn't find the resource that he needed to heal from that loss. So he created this thing called the Grief Recovery Method, wrote a book, started training other people to provide that. It's an 8-week program basically, and I've been certified in that since 2014. As I mentioned to Yvonne, I am starting to branch out and understand lots more different ways that we can work with grief. So I have Heping and John and Taisha. I think you've all heard me before on this topic. So hopefully there's some new information here for you. I'm going to share my screen. I can find it. There it is. Okay. So first off, my background is in transpersonal psychology. I have my master's in counseling psychology from JFK when they had a holistic school back in 2006. I've been licensed since 2013 and in private practice that whole time. Grief recovery specialist, and then I'm also doing the somatic experiencing training. I'm in halfway through the 3rd year of a 3-year program. And I'm also currently a clinical supervisor at Heart and Balance and CIIS. So my personal story around grief and why this is one of the areas that I've chosen to specialize in is that I had my very first loss event the day I was born when I was adopted. I had a great adoptive family. I had a supportive family. It was a good upbringing. I was safe and taken care of. But there was always something that I was aware of that made me sad. And I didn't know what it was. I always knew, since I could understand the concept, that I was adopted. And it was always a very positive story that my parents told about being adopted and how they came to adopt me. But yet there was an emptiness, a hole for me. And when I was an adolescent and a teenager, I was diagnosed with depression, put on medication, went to I think it was a psychiatrist who wasn't very helpful. No one at any time ever brought up this reality of my life, that I lost my birth mother the day I was born and how that might be impacting me. So by the time I finally put 2 and 2 together and was able to conceptualize my experience as a grief event, I was in my 40s. So over 40 years of living with this loss plus other losses that I had experienced during my lifetime that basically made me feel like there was something wrong with me because no one was talking about it. And no one could figure out like what is this thing about Tina. It just felt like something was wrong with me. And I had a lot of like relational breaches, breaks. I felt very black and white with friends. You know, if someone disappointed me or lied to me or hurt me, that was it. They were out. And I moved a lot and had trouble like attaching to places and jobs. And And then at the same time, endings were super, super hard for me. They put me into like an emotional tailspin. Um, Add on top of that, a home culture and a social culture where it's not encouraged to talk about loss, it's not normalized to talk about grief. And the idea that grief only lasts a certain amount of time, or that there's these stages of grief that one would normally go through and then they would be better, um, or that time, it just takes time to heal. Uh, so waiting around for something magical to happen and it just not happening for me encouraged me to just bury my feelings about it and just not talk about it with people and just struggle along. The accumulation over the course of my life of more and more loss events started to get so heavy for me that I really became interested in this field, not only for myself, but how to be a better listener and a better healer and a better therapist for other people who are struggling with grief and loss that maybe the people in their life so far haven't been able to help them on. So that's kind of how I came to be interested in this field. Let me just check and see if there's anyone waiting. I'm not sure if I can even do that right now. All right. So, sorry, I'm switching out my, there we go. So, understanding why relationships work the way they do and why humans behave the way they do has always been interesting to me. I've always been a listener, much more than a talker. And people a lot of times ask me for advice or would confide in me. So this thought of becoming a therapist has been around since I was in high school. I took a few detours, but ended up coming back to the therapy field in my mid 30s. And I just really wanted to understand my own psychology first, and then be able to help other people not feel so stigmatized or lost in dealing with their own psychological issues. So then once I understood my experience in the context of grief and loss, I became fascinated by this study of how people recover. And just to give you an example of one of the exercises that we use in the grief recovery method, this is called a loss history graph. And I'm curious to hear from you all. Have you ever gotten this thorough a background on any of your clients related to loss in their life? And I see Julie and John shaking their head no. Yeah, so as you might notice, even though this is a loss graph, there are things that are above this middle line, which is kind of the positive emotional aspects of these events. And then below the line are the negative emotional aspects of these events in my life. And so if you look at like graduations, moving, those can be both negative and positive emotional events. I was super excited to graduate. I was super proud of myself. I was celebrating with all my friends, and it meant I could move on to the next stage of my career. And at the same time, I knew I was also going to be losing contact with a community of people who I had grown very attached to, and knowing that we would all be going in different directions. So there's both positive and negative aspects to loss events sometimes. And I think the other thing I want to point out here is that these loss events aren't deaths. Some of them are, but there are so many other types of life events on here. Obviously the loss of my grandparents, the loss of my mother, but there's pet losses, there's lost ends of friendships, there's job endings that felt really toxic and disappointing and feeling like betrayed. There's relationship breakups, there's moving, and then of course me being born and being separated from my birth mother. All of these are types of loss events. So when we think of grief and we're assessing a client to understand what part grief has played in their life, we want to ask about all these other types of loss events too, because chances are your client is going to assume you're talking about deaths if you ask about grief. So this is a way to open up the conversation and ask about other types of loss events that still cause grief that they might not have been considering. Sorry, I lost you there for a minute. So when we look at the evolution of grief counseling and grief therapy, we can trace all of this back to, cultural and social and familial and spiritual norms, rituals, beliefs that indigenous cultures, close cultures, tribes, they would have rituals that would be passed down from generation to generation about how to recognize the end of one phase and the beginning of another. So this can include things like funeral rituals and rites, but it can also include moving from one phase of life to another, like from becoming an adolescent to becoming an adult, like a fully recognized adult in the community. And also many other types of rituals, many of which really got lost when a family or a person came to the US and was expected to acculturate to the norms and traditions here. And so a lot of those very specific and special rituals got left behind. And then we have the pandemic, which really changed the way we gathered or didn't to recognize the life of someone who had passed away. And it really interrupted the rituals that we do practice here in the US around funerals, memorial services, not being able to have those in person, and trying to struggle to find a way to still have some kind of ritual or recognition that someone's life had ended. So those are the roots, I think, of what we might call, grief counseling or grief support. And then there was this work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, which was kind of groundbreaking at the time. What a lot of people don't realize about her work, which people use this shortcut of saying it's the 5 stages of grief. What people don't realize is that she was actually working with people who had terminal illnesses, who were shoved to the back of the hospital wings, and no one was visiting. The doctors and nurses knew that they were terminal, so there was really nothing to do. So they were just in these back rooms waiting to die. And she got really curious about, wait, what's happening with these people? What is their experience? And so she started to interview them and talk to them and ask them questions about what this particular stage of their life was like for them. And out of that work, she developed this 5-stage process that people who are terminally ill generally go through. So it's DABDA: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And when you think about those as stages that someone who's about to die would go through, it's very applicable. But when you try and apply this to this other group of people, who are the people who are left, the people who are saying goodbye to that person, the people who are grieving the loss of that person, it's so different. And it's not even what she was studying. But in the absence of any other organized model, it kind of got co-opted by the community of people who are working with grievers. And over the years, people have really started to question whether it's actually applicable. And I would challenge all of us to think about our own losses. I'm going to actually stop the share because I want to see all of your faces right now. And if you feel like a time in your life when you had an ending, a loss, a death, did your grieving process follow those 5 stages in order? Yes or no? I don't see any yeses. Lexi, do you want to say anything about that, Lexi? No from Sharon.
Yeah, I suppose I was just gonna say no. My grandpa recently died, maybe about a year ago or so, and I know that sounds like a long time, but it feels very recent still. You know, my grandma has been living with us since. It's been a lot,
Yeah.
and I feel like I went through. I don't know. Maybe this is too much to share. I definitely don't feel like I went through perhaps all of this. Like I've never really thought about it. You know, I've never sat down and been like, how did I grieve? Like, what was that process? But thinking about it now, it certainly doesn't sound. It certainly doesn't sound like that is what happened. You know, it doesn't sound or feel like that's what happened.
And I would imagine, based on what you've said already, that your grieving process isn't over.
Yeah, I do. I'm someone that likes to not think about it. And that's how I can get past things. I distract myself. And so I'm sure that there's part of me who is like, yeah, I'm busy with school. I'm busy with, you know, getting my master's, getting my hours, seeing clients. I have 2 jobs right now. You know, like I have a lot going on. So I just really enjoy throwing myself at other things so that I don't have to process stuff. And so I have I have 2 of his shirts in my closet, and like I cannot bring myself to touch them, look at them for too long, smell them, like anything. Like I cannot go near them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of skip the processing so that I like don't get too sad about it, you know.
Yes,
Um
absolutely. Yep.
yeah, so I'm sure if I like went back through that, there's still a lot left that I need to process there for sure.
Yeah, and I think that we do need to know when we have the bandwidth to dive into that, because it is bringing up a lot. It does bring up a lot of emotion, and it does mean that we can't distract ourselves with busyness if we're going to feel all our feelings. So, these lives that we lead mean that we have to almost carve out a time to really attend to our grief. Thank you so much for sharing, Lexi, and I'm really sorry for your loss. Ping.
Yeah, I guess this is my personal experience. Is related to what's the capacity to process emotional stuff. For me, usually at the beginning, I don't process lots of emotion. So in that sense, so basically quite naive. In that sense, I do feel these 5 stages kind of resonate. Yeah, at the beginning, you have lots of them. Basically learn quick how to get rid of them, go through this process. Seems identify in some degree, but I can kind of think there's a lack of complexity, the really depths there. This is just okay, that's it.
Yep, that's right. Thank you for sharing. So given that no one here, I didn't see anyone identify themselves as saying, yep, that's exactly how my grief went. It went through those 5 stages, then I was done. What are the consequences of that for our clients or people who are reaching out, or maybe they haven't reached out yet? The consequences are that they feel like there's something wrong with them, that they're doing it wrong, and that there's something dysfunctional about how they're grieving, and that's why they need help. Taisha.
What I will say from my experience with people going through grief is that majority of them do go through these steps. So when I was saying no, I was saying you don't go through them in that order.
Yeah.
But I do believe that majority of the people do go through these steps. I also believe that it looks different for everyone. Right. So we might not recognize them as going through these steps. Right. They may not recognize it themselves, and maybe they don't go through every single one of them, but usually hit majority of them.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking to a client, that's one of the things I make sure I say is that we all grieve differently, and it may look different, to some, like, even in the same family, even the same siblings,
Right.
it looks different, but we all go through some sort of these. And I think usually by saying that makes them feel that they are not different, or they're not doing it right, so to speak.
Yeah, it takes a little burden off of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also just recognizing that it's okay to grieve in whichever way.
Yes.
Of course, there's those limitations that you have to, acknowledge, and, if you're grieving with alcohol or drugs or hurting or anything like that. But just making sure that they know that it's okay to grieve in their own way and their own time. I think that's really, really important. And I had a client that was grieving. Actually, I would say they're still grieving, to be honest. And it's been, I don't know, it's been many, many, many years.
Yeah.
And it's just, and there's a part of them where I believe, and I'm not going to just tell them this, I like to let my clients kind of come up with their own things, is that there's a part of it that they just won't go through.
Yeah.
Or there's a part of it that they won't acknowledge or accept, I guess is another word to say it. And which is making them hold on to it.
Mm-hmm.
I also don't think you grieve and get over it either. I don't think you just grieve and it's done.
Yeah.
I think it's something that is always kind of with you. Just learn how to cope.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you're kind of speaking to is that it's just not as simple as what we'd like to, as clinicians, think we can propose to our clients. It is unique for every person. Even two people grieving the same person had a completely different relationship with that person. And so their grief process is going to look differently. And that's okay. And it's okay if they feel depression early in the process. It's okay if they feel other emotions like resentment, jealousy, loneliness, even relief. Some of the positive feelings that you might feel for someone who's been sick for a long time, and you're kind of relieved that they're not suffering anymore. For people who have spiritual beliefs, they might be relieved to know that their loved one is with their higher power, whatever they call that. And so it's normal to have other feelings and go through other stages that may not be included in this 5-stage model. So to the degree that the 5-stage model is helpful for your client, great. But as soon as you realize that there's some things that aren't getting included or talked about or made room for, that's when we can open up to more than just 5 stages. And it doesn't mean, this isn't the Bible of grief. This isn't how it's supposed to go. I'm here to honor how it's going for you and to validate and listen with my heart open, with lots of empathy and compassion and tenderness, that this is what's true for you and it's valid. So thank you for sharing. Heping, do you mind if we keep going?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna share my screen again. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work is still one of the main models. Like if you do a grief, best, methods for grief recovery, or best resources for grief therapy, you'll see a lot of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's in the results and the 5 stages of grief. But we are moving beyond that now. The field is really opening up. Hospice centers, hospitals, funeral homes, they generally have been on the front lines of counseling people who are grieving, but it really is starting to open up to all sorts of other caregivers and pastors and family members, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, even mentors and teachers at schools, and then parents who are, these last 3 years, everyone has been grieving something. So we've all kind of needed to understand this process of like losing someone or something and how to support ourselves and each other through that process. So there is more and more literature being put out there. There's a ton of great podcasts about loss and websites and resources. And a lot of these people aren't even in the mental health field. They're just coming on and talking about, like, well, this was my experience. So I love that it's getting validated that it really can be so unique from person to person to person. And so what are the things that we have in common around this grief process? David Kessler is another big author, researcher, speaker in this field. And he was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's mentee, worked under her guidance for many years, and since her death has picked up her work and continued it into this area of what he calls a sixth step or a sixth stage, which is making meaning. And so we're really starting to ask questions and to understand how people make meaning of the different types of loss events that they can experience in their life, to come to some kind of place of peace and harmony and being able to move forward in their life. Jody Flessner has written an article or a paper that appears on the American Counseling Association's website. And the paper is called A Shift in the Conceptual Understanding of Grief Using Meaning-Oriented Therapies with Bereaved Clients. It's a really great paper. I encourage you to read it. I have a link to it at the end of this presentation, which I'll send to Yvonne to share with all of you. But the three pieces of what she's learned in her research so far about making meaning in response to a loss includes three areas. One is making sense. So the process of finding or creating a sense of understanding regarding the loss. Benefit finding, or the creation of meaningful structures that underscore positives resulting from the loss. So a simple way would be to say, like, look at the bright side, which I wouldn't encourage anyone ever to say to someone who's grieving. But when they are starting to get past the more painful parts of the loss, they can actually start to see there's some good here. And some of that may be spiritual, some of that may be familial, cultural, or just day-to-day life. There might be a relief of not worrying about this person anymore, not being a caregiver. So that benefit finding can come later in the process and can help people kind of move forward into the healing process. And then making meaning around their identity, how their identity has changed. So when my mom died, I was no longer, it felt like I was no longer a kid. Like that moment in my life, and I was like early 40s, I suddenly was like, oh, I'm the grown-up. Losing a child, being in the role of the parent to that child, that identity goes away. And if it was your only child, that means that you're not a parent at all anymore. And so how do you find meaning in your identity, your new identity? So these three areas of making meaning are some of the areas that people are starting to really look into and research and understand, and talk to clients and research subjects about how they're making meaning post-loss. So what can we do as therapists to help facilitate healing and growth? I would say number one, ask. Be willing to ask the question, are you dealing with loss? How have you dealt with loss in the past? What is the earliest loss you remember in your life? And they might need a reminder that loss isn't just death, it's all sorts of other things, moving, changing schools, losing a friend who moves away, losing a pet, even losing like a physical ability to be able to play a sport, or losing the this position in, like, I'm thinking of high school and band, how like it was so important for me to be first chair in band. And didn't, when I lost a challenge to someone else and they became first chair, I felt grief. It was sadness, it was frustration, it was like self-recrimination, it was like the motivation to like work harder. And you could call that a loss event. It's not the same kind of a loss as the death of someone important to you, but nonetheless, if we look at everything that can be a loss as something that could cause grief, then suddenly we're looking for ways that grief has shaped this person's life. Then I would say learn to guide the client in walking slowly through what happened. So I had a client who had a series of traumatic things happen to her, all in the space of like a few days. One had to do with her mom becoming terminally ill. At the same time that was happening, her house burned down in one of the California fires, and there was a few other losses happening at the same time. And she really just needed the first session. Before we even really knew each other, she just needed to tell the whole story of everything that happened to her. And at the end of that session, we both kind of took a breath. And I was like, wow, that's incredibly a lot of loss and stress and challenge and trauma all at the same time. How did it feel for you to just talk about it all? And she said, the more I kept going, the more I realized I haven't told that story about everything that happened to anyone. A lot of people know pieces of it. No one knows the whole thing until I just told you. So thank you for making room for me to just tell that story. And so our job is to be okay, to stay grounded, to know that they're alive and they've shown up in our office asking for support. So something about their resilience, their resources is working, and to have the ability to tolerate what we're hearing without absorbing it, without absorbing the trauma, without absorbing the worry, the anxiety, the fear, the deep sadness, and to be able to stay in our seat and stay present and listen to what this person has to say. And even though that might sound easy to just sit and listen, that is one of the things that a therapist needs to practice being able to do. And the therapist who can do that well without like dissociating or kind of like losing their train of concentration, or like realizing that they missed the last couple of minutes of what their client has said, that skill right there is going to put you head and shoulders above so many other clinicians that I can't stress it enough. So then we have the clients who come in and they're not quite so verbose. And maybe it's hard for them to know what to bring up or whether to bring up something. Or maybe they're still building some trust with you to know how you're going to respond if they share some really tough, upsetting, sad, challenging things with us. And so it's good to have a few questions that open the door. So one of the things I ask people is it okay for me to say their name? Would that be okay with you? How would that feel? And if you're not ready, I won't use their name, but I want to find a respectful way to refer to the person who you've lost. And a lot of people will say, yeah, their name was such and such. Thank you so much for asking. And it's a relief that we can say that person's name here together. And I'll ask, can we talk about the good times? Can we talk about the bad times? Or like, what's off limits right now? What do you not have the bandwidth to really talk about? Because I wanna make it clear that we can talk about anything. And sometimes it might be hard to know where to start. So I might ask you some specific questions, but I want to know what we should table for later. And then how traumatic were the circumstances of this ending? And do I have an inkling that their nervous system is still in reaction, or their nervous system is such that this is just one more loss in a series of losses, in a series of like traumas, that their nervous system is really working hard, like overworking to try and compensate for. And do I need to really slow down and use some somatic approaches? Do I need to resource them first before we go into the story of what happened? Two other just kind of generally good piece of advice for anytime we're with someone who's grieving, whether it's a client, a friend, a family member, a colleague, is to not use platitudes. And when I say platitudes, I mean things like, it just takes time, or, they're in a better place, or you'll feel better 6 months from now. It will get better. Yeah, it will. But what that's doing is saying, like, I can't be here with you right now. I'm going to jump to the future when things are better, and I'm going to hold out hope that you can meet me there when things are better for you. But it's really an abandonment of our client or our friend in where they are right now. And don't make empty promises about like when it's going to be better. I have a client whose psychiatrist has multiple times told her, after losing her partner in a traumatic car accident, that she would be better in 6 months. And she stuck to that belief that she would feel better in 6 months. And so every time she said that, my client would just get so enraged with her and feel like I can't talk to her about any of this because she just thinks I'm going to get better in 6 months and I just have to wait for that time to pass. That's not being a good clinician. And then finally, don't make assumptions about what they need or what the end goal is. In certain circles, there might be beliefs about what the right way to heal is, and whether that person should be still feeling all their feelings, or talking about that person, or remembering them with pictures, talking about them every year on the anniversaries of birthdays and wedding anniversaries and the death anniversary. Some people think that that's not healthy, and they'll tell people, yeah, you really need to let go of that because you're just keeping yourself in the painful part of the grief. That's not right for everyone. So what their end goal is, we need to help them figure out where they'd like to be, what feels right and respectful and peaceful and feels like healing for them, without telling them that this is what your healing is going to look like. I'm going to pause here. I have a few more slides to go through, but I just want to see if anyone has comments or questions. Should I keep going? Yeah? Okay. If you do have something, put it in the chat. I will see that. I might not see your hand, but I will see a chat. Go back to share. So this question, I've been doing this training for a number of years, and so I added this slide in when the pandemic hit. And I'm just wondering, like, what have you seen change in your own life? What have you lost that perhaps you're grieving, or your clients are grieving, or people you know are grieving since going into lockdown and social distancing and working online with clients versus in person? What are you aware of in terms of losses in your life? Anyone brave enough to share?
Personally, for me, it has does not have a big impact. Just in terms of a social, I'm probably that's only my personality.
Mhm.
But I do see many of my friends, not my friends, my client was hit by isolation.
One change that we all went through as therapists was getting to meet our clients in person, at least for a time. Right? That's a loss. And it changed. It changed our role, changed how we show up. Maybe some of us weren't so comfortable with
Maybe, yeah, I
videos.
feel maybe I didn't start quite long. I just started just 1 year before. So I see. I felt online actually have more advantage. I can observe
Yeah, yeah.
more.
And so you jump right to the meaning making, right? Like there's benefits for you. Absolutely. And there was a loss. And one of the definitions of like a grief event, like a loss, is that it's a change in your familiar pattern of behavior. Any change in your familiar pattern of behavior that you've just gotten used to, this is how your everyday life goes. This is how you meet with clients. This is how you go to the store. This is how you get places. This is who you talk to on a weekly basis. There was some at least something that changed for every one of us. And it's okay. That I think the implication isn't that oh, you're suffering, you're struggling, you need help, you need to go talk to someone. No, that's not the implication. The implication is just to let's normalize the conversation to just acknowledge when there's been a loss. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong, doesn't mean the person needs help, but it's okay to acknowledge that there's been a loss. And when we're able to acknowledge that, sometimes our clients will start to acknowledge it for themselves and recognize, like, oh, well, I did start to act differently, or I did start to feel differently, or I did start to have this weird skin rash right around that time, or, all sorts of things that like will pop up and we don't necessarily think that they're related, but we can acknowledge that there was a big change that happened 3 years ago.
So I work at a school. I work at a TK through 12 school, and I'm mostly around high school students. So what I would say, the whole social connection, I feel like has been completely lost. Kids don't know how to talk to each other, or even express anything. So I would say that definitely the social aspect of it that's an obvious one, but also the will to even try. So a lot of the high school students, they just, at least where I'm at, is they kind of got comfortable with being, my daughter was in high school at that time, and just the idea of just rolling out of bed and not even doing your hair or was something that she got very used to. And then we went back to school in person. She was like, I just don't feel like doing it anymore. So just the will to do things seems like, took a while for students, and some still do not have it.
Yeah.
Some are very socially awkward. So if they were already socially awkward, it just made it worse.
Yeah.
So we were dealing with a lot of that in the high school. And then, even this to go outside, just in general.
Yeah.
So a lot of our younger students, our lower school students, do not know what it is like to go outside and play in the front yard.
Yeah.
Or even feel that it's okay to do that, depending on how their parents are reacting to them, even still going outside.
Yeah.
So
hanging out with them,
so that's what the lower school students and with our middle school students, they're just, already in a discovery time, being in middle school in general.
Yeah.
So I think that they lost, you kind of have like a social idea of who you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And with our middle school students who are trying to follow that, but then also be themselves, it seems that they're just kind of wandering, like they're just lost.
Yeah. They lost like a structure.
Right.
Yeah. That when so much is changing, at least there was something that was constant. Hopefully it was their family or, their, friend group and somehow. But yeah, that most of their life is around school. So that structure just fell away. And the reason I think it's important to name these kinds of losses that aren't deaths and to acknowledge them is that we might see people's behaviors, attitudes, emotions, acting out behaviors, we might see them change when there's a loss, especially if that loss isn't getting acknowledged by the people in their life. So how do we as the adults around, kids who are really struggling, they might not know how to talk about what's been lost, but we can normalize that for them and say, yeah, I would be sad and frustrated and uncomfortable and scared and anxious about that too. Julie.
So for me personally, I moved to California in late 2019 and then pandemic hit in March.
Yeah.
So I didn't really meet a lot of people. And then working from home, didn't really meet a lot of people at all. And then when things started to lighten up a little bit, I still didn't meet people. So it was like, and there still is a huge fear around letting people into the inner circle, and established groups became so important during the pandemic. Plus, I had a lot of personal loss that I dealt with, which kind of made the isolation about 500 times worse. So I was, I couldn't travel. I'm the only person in my family that lives in California, and everybody else is a long plane ride away. It's not like you can drive. So I was like going nuts trying to meet people, and I had to stay home, and I was okay staying home, but I wanted that escape from my house.
Mm-hmm.
And with clients, particularly with teens, I've noticed that a lot of them are talking about depression and the sadness, and they can't get out of bed, and they sleep for 15 hours a day, and they don't want to do homework, they don't want to do school. And I think I've also seen that a lot of them felt like prisoners in their home. They had unstable family lives, and then they were quarantining within those situations, which made it, it compounded what they were going through. So I feel like I've noticed that on a personal level and with clients, that there was this need to escape the environment. You couldn't go anywhere because, what would happen. And I've also noticed when I talk with clients, like in the first session or so, that they talk about their symptoms and how school is really a challenge, and exactly what Taisha, you were saying, that it's really hard to socialize. And a lot of them don't even think about the pandemic, and they don't think about staying home. And that could be a cause of, some of what they're facing as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of kids are also aware of, at some level, of the adults around them, and however the adults are processing the uncertainty, anxiety, the stresses of the pandemic, what's changed in their life, and they don't maybe have a place to talk about it. And so kids are maybe aware that, wow, all the adults are kind of like on edge. And I don't exactly know why, because maybe this wasn't such a huge aha to them. Like, this is unprecedented in our lifetime, what we're going through. It was just like, oh, this is what we're being told to do. But then seeing all the adults around them have such trouble, like, changing and adapting and not having the resources they need. So many schools just didn't have the resources they need or guidance on how to do this well and how to support the kids, that they could feel it, but no one was talking about it. And then your kids who are coming into therapy, they're not going to come in and talk about it because they don't know how to name that. And so now we're back to like what I experienced in my adolescence, where it just got called depression and I got medicated. Or maybe it's being called ADHD now, So how do we, as depth psychotherapists, people who are really trying to understand all of the pieces at play and how to really support our clients in healing and growth and moving past some of these challenges. If we don't understand that those things are at play, then we can't help them. We're just giving them band-aids. Thanks for everyone sharing. I think I want to take like a 5-minute break and then come back. So come back about 7 after, take care of yourself, get some air if you need to, and see you at 7 after. All right, so let's see if I can stretch this out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one tool in particular that has been around for over 30 years, but not a lot of people know about it. It's called the Grief Recovery Method, and this is what I was certified in back in 2014. And it's a tool to walk people through a step-by-step process around how to recognize where they're incomplete with a loss from the past, and then how to get complete. In order to use this tool, you need to be certified, and it's a weekend certification program, so it's accessible, it's quick to do, and it's really one of the most useful tools that I've had so far to help people with grief. I'm definitely branching out and looking at other techniques and tools, and this is a tool that's mostly used with adults. So when we think about kids, working with kids using the grief recovery method, who we want to work with are the meaningful adults in their life, to make sure that the adults in their life are practicing the tools of grief recovery and teaching the children in their life by behavior modeling and language modeling. This can be used in groups, one-on-one, on Zoom, in person, and it can really supplement someone's individual therapy. If they're already in therapy, it doesn't compete with, because not every certified grief recovery specialist is a therapist. Some people are just community members, church members, pastors, funeral directors. Not everyone is a mental health clinician. So it can really be used in supplement to individual therapy. And I'm going to share some of the tenets of grief recovery, because I think that it's been one of the most clear models beyond the 5 stages of loss that I've found working in the grief counseling arena. So they have a definition of grief that is 3 parts. 1, grief is the normal and natural reaction to a significant emotional loss of any kind. Other folks in different arenas talk about a meaningful attachment, losing a meaningful attachment to someone or something can be a cause of grief. The grief recovery method also says that it can be a conflicting set of feelings caused by the end of or a change in a familiar pattern of behavior. And then it can also feel like reaching out for someone who's either always been there and now they're not, for the hardest thing that you may have experienced in your relationship with them is losing them, and they're not there to talk to about it, or someone who's never been there for you in the way that you needed, and now that chance is gone. It's never going to be a better relationship. These are the things that cause grief and how we describe grief. The myths that get perpetuated all the time, and I challenge you to read anyone's post on Facebook or Instagram about losing someone and look at the comments. You will invariably find at least one of these kinds of comments in the comments on their post, and it's people meaning well and wanting them to recover and be okay, but they are really myths about how grief really operates. One of them is don't feel bad, don't feel sad, don't feel guilty, don't cry, don't worry, don't. This is not the way to be a supportive person in a griever's life, by telling them not to feel their feelings. That is certainly a way for them to cover up and bury and not be honest with you or other people in their life about how they're feeling. And what happens when we bury our feelings? You know, they build, they accumulate, they cause problems, and then they come out in strange and inappropriate ways. So whenever you catch yourself or someone else saying, don't feel, and then fill in the blank, just take it back and say, you know what? You can feel however you want to feel, and I'm just going to stay here and listen. I'm going to validate that. I'm going to mirror that back to you. I'm going to reflect that I hear what you're saying and that I understand, or maybe I don't understand because I haven't been in your shoes, but that I see that this is really real for you. Another thing that people tell each other is that we have to be strong. So you have to be strong for your kids, or you have to be strong for a parent, or you have to be strong for your siblings, or you have to just be strong and you'll get through this. Well, I think that we've seen people who are really strong really break in painful and damaging ways. And so it's actually a better suggestion to, you know what, you can be weak in this moment and I'm not going to judge you. And I'm not going to think less of you. And there's nothing wrong with you that you're having these feelings. You don't have to be strong for me because I can bear witness to your feelings without collapsing myself. People do all sorts of things to keep busy and avoid thinking about it or dealing with it. Workaholism, is a great example of people, who you see who are, their calendar is just full of stuff. And maybe some of their complaints are that they don't have time for self-care, they don't have time, or they're showing up late to everywhere they go. They're so busy, they fill every moment that and it's very effective at helping them avoid feeling their feelings, but they're going to burn out at some point, or they're going to burn out their relationships at some point. People are going to get frustrated that they're always late, or that they can't get their attention, or it feels like they're not creating intimacy in their relationship because they're just always busy. Another myth is that it's the way that you get over a loss is to replace it with something. The most common example is a pet. We lose a pet, and a lot of people will run out and get another pet right away before they've had a chance to really grieve the loss of their other pet. And this just causes all sorts of bypassing of emotions, and also recognizing it lowers the tolerance for how this new pet is different. What's missing, or how their personality is different, or they're not as much of this as my other pet. And then we get mad at that pet, or we detach, or we don't take as good care of them. So just replacing the loss does not fix the feelings of grief. And I've mentioned this one before, that it just takes time. You just gotta, you'll feel better with time. You just gotta get through, and one day you'll feel better. This just isn't how grief works. And a lot of experiences in our life teach us that grieving alone is the only way that we actually can grieve, that our friends and family are going to feel burdened by our emotions, that they might not be able to relate, that they don't know how to fix it. There's nothing that they can do to make us feel better, so I'm not going to talk about it. Or I have talked about it, and the responses that I get just make me mad, or they make me feel unseen, or they make me feel judged. So, or just it dampens the mood wherever I am. So I'm just going to keep it to myself, and I'm going to deal with my grief when I'm alone. And then the bonus myth that I add is that there are 5 stages of grief. It's just not that simple. So this is all from the grief recovery method, and this is kind of their approach, that understanding what grief really is and the myths that really are myths that don't help us with our grief, that this forms the foundation from which we go looking for where we're unresolved. And this is the kind of the target of what we in the grief recovery method are helping people discover, so that they can find a pathway, or we can show them a pathway to how to get complete with something that's been left unresolved due to a loss. So the 3 parts of what unresolved grief is: 1, it's about things we wish we'd said or done more, better, different. So for an example, like, I wish I hadn't, had that fight with my, my friend before they died. I wish I had spent more time with my parents before they were gone. I feel really bad for some of the, ways I treated this person before they were gone, and now I'm consumed with guilt. Those are just a few examples of ways that we get stuck with a feeling that can never actually get resolved, because that person's never going to be back here for us to do it differently or to apologize to them. The second part of what unresolved grief can be are the unrealized hopes, dreams, and expectations that we had for the future. So one of the big examples in my life is that I'm now 55, and as I was getting into my 40s, my vision for my life hadn't really come true, and it didn't look like it was going to come true. And this was a vision that had been growing and building and had been created when I was an adolescent. And the older I got and the further out of my fertility years that I got, the more I was realizing that I was going to need to grieve and say goodbye to the hope of having children. But the thought of grieving that dream for myself, the only thing I could picture that was on the other side of letting go of the dream of having children was despair, was meaningless, was purposeless, was like everything else I could think of was paled in comparison to the value of being a parent and having kids. So I put off doing that work for many, many, many years, because I was afraid of what was on the other side of letting go of that dream. But when I actually did the work, which meant I was ready to do it, I didn't force myself, but when I did that work, I really did get complete with the idea that had been generating since I was like 12. And I had compassion and empathy for the part of me that was still alive that wanted those things. But in saying goodbye to that dream, it made room for a new updated dream, a dream that I have for myself now looking forward versus 12 or 13 and looking at the course of my life and what I thought I wanted. And the third part of what unresolved grief can look like is undelivered communications of an emotional nature. So things that I never got to say, or things that I wish I could have said, or things I need to say to a person or an animal or a house or a town or a job or whatever. But I couldn't, either because they couldn't hear it, they would argue with me or tell me not to feel that way, or I feel like I didn't get heard. Like I never got really heard that this is what I need to say to someone, so that them hearing it allows me to let it go. So these are the kind of the targets, like I said, of what we go looking for in grief recovery, and then use some very specific tools to get complete and say goodbye to the past. the goals of grief recovery, the grief recovery method, are that once we've delivered those emotional communications to a dedicated listener, not to the person that we are grieving, but to a neutral third party, and we've said goodbye to what's been causing us pain, that we can actually achieve completion in that relationship. And what this can look like is being able to access fond memories again without them turning painful, to have let go of any unmet hopes, dreams, and expectations that we've been holding on to, and to be available and open to the idea of new dreams, new relationships, new pets, new partners, new jobs, whatever it is, with the understanding and the resilience to know that it's not guaranteed, that we might experience loss again, but that will be okay. That I feel able to hold that complexity, that dual truth, that I can hope again, I can go after things that I want in my life again, knowing that sometimes I'll probably not achieve those things, or that they'll end when I don't want them to. But I feel like I'm, having gotten complete with the past, I feel like I can bear that now. So, how can you do a better job at being an open, safe, empathetic person for any griever, whether it's a client or someone in your life? Number one, be a heart with ears. Don't live in your head and be thinking about how can I fix this for them, or what's the right thing to say here? Like, maybe you don't know what to say, but you can say, I care. I'm listening and I feel the pain. I feel the sadness. I'm not going to try and race away from those feelings. I'm right here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving you to feel this on your own. My heart is available and my mind is taking a back seat. You can reserve judgment, criticism, analysis, commentary, advice. Just put that in a bucket and put it to the side. It's not helpful, it's not necessary, and it certainly doesn't foster open communication and tell grievers, you can say more here. You can talk more about what you're feeling and what you're going through, because I don't have an opinion about it. I want you to share it with me because I want you to know I'm here with you, and I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong. I'm not going to tell you how to get over this. I'm not going to compare you to what I think some normal is. And this is where I think a lot of clinicians and psychiatrists get into trouble, because they're relying on something like the DSM to say, well, grief generally lasts 6 months, and after that, it's depression. That can really scare a griever into not sharing with their doctors and their therapists what's really going on, because they don't want to be pathologized. And it can also scare the crap out of them that there's something really wrong with them, that they're still grieving after 6 months. Another way to be with grievers is to just be curious, to ask questions, and to acknowledge that even if you don't understand how they're experiencing this, that it's true for them. And that it's not our job, or it's not required for us to comment or decide whether it's functional or dysfunctional, healthy or not healthy, but to just acknowledge this is their experience and this is very real for them. Whether it's a pet guinea pig or the most important person in their life. All grief is felt at 100%, no matter the kind of relationship it was. And finally, be a caring witness for the griever in your own life, to express their emotions, acknowledge and validate their experience. So the people in your life, the people that you see on social media, when you're going to make a comment, when you see someone has shared that they've lost someone or something, find words that express that you hear them, that you validate it, that you're acknowledging their experience, whatever that is. This is a little cartoon that I found that it just makes me laugh because I think as therapists, we are constantly trying to think of the right intervention, the right thing to do, which, and then we're stuck in our own head about like, oh no, I don't know enough about this topic to do the right thing. Maybe I'm not a good enough therapist. We just get stuck in our own heads. And this is what it's like on like the other person's side of the conversation. So the ones in white clouds are just what the person on the right is thinking. Nailed it. And you know, the person on the right is probably just as confused about why their friend is thanking them, but it's this kind of magical thing that we forget about sometimes, that just being quiet and listening is okay. It really is one of the only places in therapy in someone's life to be able to talk uninterrupted and have someone not offer all these platitudes and these empty promises and these myths and advice and solutions. Like, it's one of the only places where they can show up and just say what they're feeling and have it listened to. So I love this because it speaks to the most basic parts of what it needs to be in relationship. And sometimes not saying anything can be therapeutic. So always remember that. These are just some of the examples of what I've used the grief recovery method in my own life to get complete on. And there's a lot of different types of losses here. I continue to use this tool for my own grief healing whenever I realize that something has kind of come up and taken my attention and it's maybe getting in my way of having access to my heart. Maybe it's getting in the way of being a great listener for other grievers, whether it's clients or friends. And I continue to use this method as a way to get complete with the past and have that pain and sadness and maybe other negative feelings kind of resolve themselves. I'm gonna share this PowerPoint with you through email, but these are just more suggestions about how to incorporate grief in your therapy work. Definitely make it part of your assessment. You know, ask people what experiences they've had with loss, not just death. If they have a diagnosis, especially depression or anxiety or OCD, or maybe even they're using substances or activities as distractions from hard feelings, might be including grief and loss. Ask them when those things started and whether there were any losses that happened around the same time in their life. And whatever methods you use, find a way to do your own grief work and practice these listening skills with a colleague or a friend so that you are kind of evolving in the way that you can be a listener, that you can sit with other people's pain and grief without dissociating or running away or trying to give advice. When we do our own work and heal our own stuff in our life, it makes us that much more able to be present when clients show up with those kinds of issues. And it's just more suggestions. So the last slide here is, and then I'll just flip forward through kind of some resources that you can see on the attachment that Yvonne will send you. When to know when to refer out. So I think there's some really important limits of, if grief is not a topic that you feel that you're skilled in, that you're willing to look at some of the more current research and modalities and approaches to working with grief. If that's not an interest area of yours, to know that there are people who are specializing in grief and loss, and that sometimes our clients are going to benefit from someone who has a lot of tools in their toolkit to work with grief. And recognizing when sometimes in your own life, you're going through grief, you're going through a loss of some sort, and it's kind of preventing you from making room for your client, or you're finding that you're getting impatient with their stuckness in their grief or their attitudes about their grief. Whenever that kind of countertransfer is showing up, get consultation and consider referring out to a grief specialist, especially if you're trying to constantly fix or look at the bright side, kind of talk with your clients. If that's what you find yourself doing, know that it's time to like either work on some of your own stuff or refer that person out for a specific grief work. So this, we have, let's see, we have about half an hour left. And I want to know what kind of questions you have. I'm going to review the questions that I wrote down at the beginning. And I'll start with those. So Heping had a question about a client who jumps around from therapist to therapist. Do you want to say a little bit more about what they've shown up in your therapy with them and how this is kind of played out in your therapy?
I have only one or two. I have only 2 sessions with him, so I do not know. It's kind of a hard to open, and I don't know. I don't know. I have no idea. I just wondering if there was some grief things relate to this kind of behavior.
Yeah, it's possible. It's hard to know without being able to ask the questions. There might be a question that you could formulate as part of your practice that helps the person open the door to naming what kind of loss they've had in their life. And knowing that they've had a few different therapists, my guess is that there's a kind of grief that a client can experience, which is, I had an expectation of how this therapist was going to show up for me and how it was going to help, and now that expectation has been dashed.
Yeah, I have that feelings. Yes.
Yeah.
It's looking for particular things, and whatever way, the new way, it's kind of those tunnel visions. He's waiting for certain things.
Yeah. I'd be really curious about what that is. Like, what does this client really want and need and expect from me? Because I want to be able to actually try and give that to them. So you've got, you've only had 2 sessions. You have a lot to learn about this person. But maybe there's something really important that you could be the therapist who can ask the questions about what that is, that they didn't feel comfortable or safe or seen or held by these other folks.
Yeah, I think this is stage. I'm gonna try to make more inquiry about myself. There must be some things there.
Yeah. Good luck.
Thank you.
Lexi.
I guess I just was wondering, and this could be like situation for pretty much any like kind of work we're trying to do with clients, but just something that I have experienced, and actually it was with my first client ever, who was just finding out that she might be diagnosed with some kind of lung cancer, and she's 56 and she didn't, I don't know, a lot of stuff going on, and she kind of like wasn't, it felt like she wasn't taking it really seriously, like and that's fine, like that's all good, but it felt like whenever I was trying to talk to her about stuff, she didn't take me seriously. And so I just was wondering if you have any any input or thoughts on, if it is, somewhat clear, right, that a client is grieving something in particular, right? Like they have just told you, yeah, my mom just died or something.
Mhm.
And, in their eyes, they're grieving it and everything, and you're trying to do work with them and they're just not taking it seriously. I just was wondering if you had any input on that.
We could see that as their defense mechanism of choice, right?
Right.
We could also see that if we do use Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model, because if she herself has a diagnosis and it's life-threatening, lung cancer is life-threatening, that she might actually be in that first phase of denial. And so I would go looking for, okay, working with people who have a serious diagnosis, how do we work in that first phase? Not try and push someone out of that phase before they're ready, but how do we work when someone's in the denial phase? And that
Okay.
it might mean joining her in the things that she's focused on right now and what's important to her as she comes to terms with the diagnosis and maybe moves into that second phase.
Okay. Got you. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Lexi. Shannon, do you can talk or you can type it into the
Oh
chat?
yeah, no, I can talk.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry everybody. I'm recovering from a surgery, so I might sound a little out of it, but I'm just curious about that question I put in the beginning about, because I have a specific client I can kind of talk about, but it's kind of trying to figure out if it just in self-pity, and I don't really, sometimes I feel like it's not really authentic grieving. Like, and then I am worrying about, like, am I judging how they're grieving? Like that kind of countertransference. Am I thinking they should be further along? And I really like working with grief a lot. Like I work with people with a lot of terminal illness and stuff. And I think it's just interesting because with this one client, it's something about how they're grieving that I'm having a really hard time with. So they lost their pet several months ago, and basically their dog got ran over by a car.
Oh.
And I just feel like at this point, though, sometimes the way they're grieving is it's different, right? Like, so, and I'm trying to honor, like, everyone grieves different, but they grieve very publicly. So they do a lot of public sharing on social media. They send out group texts and emails, often with explicit pictures and of the dog in the grave. And
Oh, wow.
they still haven't gotten rid of any of the dog's things.
Yeah.
And then they tell me that they don't really feel alive unless they're crying about this. So they're really doing a lot of crying, and I'm doing air quotes, but I'm like, are they really grieving? Like, because I feel like they want a lot of attention, and they want to, it feels very self-pitying to me and like a lot of victimizing themselves. And then, so I worry I'm like judging their grieving process, but I don't, if I'm following my gut, I'm like, I don't know if this is like true grieving. I feel like almost they need to grieve alone a little bit.
Well, this is why when I say it can be a complicated mix of emotions, that grief doesn't always just look like sadness. It can be a very complicated mix of emotions. And what I can imagine, if I use my empathy muscle, that person might be feeling is a lack of justice, right? Like an indignation about the way that this beloved pet's life ended, and feeling almost like a loyalty to the memory of that pet, to keep that memory alive in a positive way, versus this ending that is just so wrong that a pet's life would be ended that way, right? And I don't know if she knows who the driver of the car was. She may have had no contact with them. So it's this anonymous, like more.
I actually had a good response. The person came in the home and then they went to the vet together.
I see.
Looked like a complete stranger.
Right.
So it actually like seemed like it was a little bonding there.
Yeah.
But
so there's two ways that I would approach this if it were my client. One is I would go back and look at the whole, I would do like what's called a relationship graph of the whole life with the dog, from beginning to end, all of the ups, the downs, the good, the bad, the memorable events of that relationship, to put this ending in context,
Okay.
and to remind them of all the good of this relationship and all the challenges of this relationship, that it was a normal, balanced relationship with this pet, to kind of bring them to the whole scope of it, rather than all of their energy being really focused on the ending part.
Mhm.
I
Right.
would also be really curious about, and then there's some steps after that, which I'm happy to talk about one-on-one if you'd like to. But it's kind of, what's the word? It's the protocol of the grief recovery method. So I don't, I can't give away all the steps without you guys having been certified. But the other thing that makes me curious about this is that sometimes, especially pet loss, can often stir up unresolved losses from early in their life, because pet relationships are often so pure,
Yeah.
and pets are just such an uncomplicated relationship, and there's not usually a whole lot that we hold on to that we're like mad at them for, or that we feel like they did something to hurt us. Like, we know pets aren't doing something to hurt us, they're just being animals. So the relationship often opens the door to this really pure kind of grief, that
Mhm.
then grief from prior losses in their life kind of rides the coattails of that grief and comes into their experience. And so I'd be really curious about whether there are other more complicated losses earlier in this person's life, who focusing their grief on the pet helps them avoid the complicatedness of these other relationships, of other losses.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely, that's really helpful, Tina. I think also that there was a lot of weight put into this relationship with their pet, and I feel like that weight, I guess, of that being not there anymore, it feels like it's getting displaced, like almost they want now everyone else to feel the
Right.
pain. So, because I feel like just sending out those group texts and things like, so that's what I'm just, and then I really understand about not giving the advice, right? So I'm trying not to do that. But then
Yeah.
I sometimes get confused there. Like, well,
Yeah.
should they put away, shouldn't they get out of the, because every time they get in the car, they see the leashes and the toys.
Ah, right. Yeah.
They like the cycle. So I think what you're
Yeah.
saying is true, because I think it's something much deeper. Yeah.
Well, there's an element of trauma here too, right? And sometimes people get stuck in a trauma loop that they can't get away from, the images, the sounds, the smells, the memories, because they're kind of caught in a trauma loop.
Yeah.
And it's almost like familiar to them to put a visual to that feeling that they have inside, which is, I can't get out of this feeling, that, like, the shock, the horror, the indignation, the grief, that, like, all of this hitting me all at once. I can't get out of that state, and I need everyone else to recognize that I'm in that state still, of like this shock to the system. And that, when we look at like somatic ways of working with someone, we can see that their nervous system hasn't been able to process through and bring the parasympathetic system back online. And then there's the making meaning part, which is the more cognitive part. Like, they haven't been able to first release the energy from their nervous system to then start processing their emotions and making meaning. So they're kind of stuck in a trauma loop. And so if you have trauma-based tools where you can work not so much with the content, but with how the body and the nervous system are holding this event, you might be able to find some openings with them on how to release that pent-up energy.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shannon. Ping.
Yeah, I have a follow-up questions here. In this case, if the client just crying at this moment, is it proper to make inquiry about crying? What is this crying about or something? I don't know, because of crying, I'm feeling here some client maybe have a deeper grief at this moment. Any inquiry that to think about something else. I don't know. This is a proper or will that help?
I mean, like every answer that, trainers give you, it depends, right? It depends. For some people, they've been holding that emotion in for a long, long time. And the fact that they're finally releasing it and letting it be expressed through tears is the resolution that they've been stuck from feeling.
Yeah.
I want to make room for not analyzing. We're therapists. We tend to be people who want to understand, and we tend to use this, the limited language that we have to try and understand and join and find new places to go with clients. But we want to make enough room for the raw emotion. Emotion is energy.
Yeah.
And when we see someone having tears, there's energy being released. And part of our job is to know when they need that release, and for us to just bear witness and not freak out and not, hand them a tissue and try and get them to feel better, but to non-verbally communicate to them that it's okay that you're feeling this. And I'm not scared that you're feeling this. I'm not overwhelmed that I'm seeing all these tears come out. It's okay for you to be right here where you are. And then when I watch that person, there'll usually be a breath, or there'll be eye contact again. There'll be some kind of a signal that the wave is starting to recede. That's when I might ask them to reflect on what were you aware of as the tears were coming? Did you have images in your head? Do you have thoughts in your head? Do you have wishes that can't ever come true? I think it's more like that question, what are the tears saying, happens more for me when the tears feel a little bit out of alignment with what I might expect them to be expressing in that moment. It seems like it's not quite a fit.
Okay, yeah, okay. I agree with you. No, so my intention is not to say something or lead somewhere. It's really the awareness. But I think what you answered the question here is depends on if you can sense it's there, they're open to awarely go a step back. Okay, what's going on here? Because it's happening. Right, it's happening. There must have something triggered. Either they can relieve. Okay, I relieve my energy. That's good. Or they can go deeper. Oh, something triggered me. This energy. That it's not really. It's something new they can discover.
Yeah.
Go deeper.
Okay. Yeah, and I think this is where empathy really gets a workout. If working very hard to figure out how can I understand and put myself in their shoes and try and understand why this particular set of tears are coming. What do I imagine they're feeling right now? What were we just talking about? What led to this? Was it a release of energy? Was it a sudden realization? Was it a letting down of a defense mechanism? What can I see knowing this client that just happened in the last 10 minutes? How can I interpret that? And then be present from that place, versus this more detached kind of what's happening for you. Sometimes people can't explain what's happening for them. They're explaining through their tears or the emotion that's coming out. That's the only way that they know how to do it. So sometimes they can't really answer that question. So kind of really using the empathy muscle and trying to imagine what just happened there energetically, emotionally, cognitively, relationally even. Am I aware of something that just happened or shifted?
Thank you.
You also asked about how to help parents with their kids who are experiencing loss, right, Heping?
Yeah. I think I get partial answer. So basically, this is not loss. It's a loss. You talk about the lost identity. I have a certain Daniel self-representations. Now I not realize it's not working definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, they might or may not aware they're hanging on this identity, but that's cause grave.
I think with kids, like helping adults understand kids is, it's a whole field, first of all. But there's some important things to remember. One is that kids might not show their grief in the same way adults would, or in these predictable ways that kind of match what we expect when someone's grieving, like crying, being in their room alone. It might look like very different kinds of behavior. So tracking when the behavior started, or where it occurs, like if it happens in certain places or with certain people, can kind of help us understand what it might have to do with. Like if they're extremely obstinate with one person in particular, there might be something in their relationship from the past that became unresolved for them. Like they're still holding on to resentment or anger or hurt around something that adult did, and the adult hasn't taken responsibility for it or apologized. And this happens a lot in the power dynamic with adults and kids. Adults often don't apologize for something they did that hurt or offended or disregarded a kid. And kids hold on to it. So that's one thing to remember, is that grief is going to look different on kids than it does on adults. And that if we are finding ourselves impatient with a kid's grief behavior or acting out behavior, then there's probably a way that we are not willing to look at our own experiences with that particular loss or with that experience in our life. And we've got some unresolved stuff that we've just pushed away and said, well, it doesn't matter, there's nothing I can do about it now, or I was powerless back then, I'm powerless now, and I don't want to hang out in that powerlessness, so I'm just going to get into power and I'm going to try and make this kid forget about it. It's like, no, that's not how it works. So wherever you have your own kind of like stuckness, things that haven't been resolved in your own past, sometimes like when a kid is experiencing the same thing, it will cause us to be really rigid about how we're letting that kid be seen by us.
Yeah, in this particular case, I'm talking about the parents' behavior.
Yeah.
The parents actually conceptually understand, but it's really hard to let go. And I thought this is probably related to the grief. He understand, but everything happened just triggered that he has to be in that position again.
Yeah. So there's some stuff from his past to go back and work on. I mean, that's anyone who's a parent knows that, like, at different points in your kids' lives, they're gonna be going through stuff that triggers your own memories of stuff that you've been through, and you're gonna look at your parents in a different way, and you're gonna look at your childhood through a new lens. And so there can be more stuff to kind of process as your kids grow and go through these different phases of their life. And sometimes, we've gotten so good at like putting something in the past and forgetting about it that it shocks us when we're like, oh my God, like I just had this memory, or I just had this dream of something that happened when I was a kid, and I can feel it again. I haven't felt that way in decades, and this kid is showing me how that feels. So there's some stuff from the past to go back and just clean up and get complete with.
Thank you.
In terms of like the working with kids and adolescents, I don't have a whole lot of experience working specifically with grief with kids, but there's lots of great programs and people who specialize in working with kids. So I would defer that question to, someone who's actually been trained to work with loss with kids, because there's some really great tools and models. I'm just not trained in them. Did I miss anything else that people had asked for at the beginning? Or anything that's come up during the presentation? What do you think, Yvonne?
I really enjoyed it. It was kind of nice to be off, you know, and just listening.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. I think I'm going to do that more.
Well, what I will do is send the recording. I'll send a link to the recording and my PowerPoint to Yvonne so she can share it with all of you. And I just want you to know that I'm a resource. I'm one of your colleagues. I am, I've chosen this specialty area, and so I'm continually learning. And if you ever have a question or would like to consult about a client, I am available to you.
Well, thank you, Tina.
Thank you for having me.
Again, we'll see you again soon for the
Next year.
No, that we're having you for the, your professional ID thing.
Marketing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a whole new presentation too around ethical marketing.
Oh, okay. Sounds good.
All right.
Need all that. Okay,
It's
bye.
nice to
See you later.
see everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.